Sophie stepped out of Cafe Verona, her white summer dress flowing gracefully around her. The soft glow of evening lights shimmered on her black leather handbag, which swayed gently as she walked. She had just spent an hour laughing with friends after work, her heart lighter than it had been all week. But as she turned onto Rosewood Avenue, her peaceful evening unraveled. Two uniformed officers approached. One was Marcus, broad-shouldered and towering, his icy stare making the air feel heavier. His partner, Ethan, looked younger and nervous, his stern face barely masking the uncertainty in his eyes. "Good evening, miss." Marcus's voice cut through the quiet street. "We're investigating a theft nearby. Mind if we take a look inside your bag?" Sophie's step faltered, but she composed herself. "A theft? I just left Cafe Verona. I haven't seen anything suspicious," she replied calmly. Marcus's gaze swept over her, lingering in a way that made Sophie uncomfortable. "Routine check. You can't refuse," he said, his tone sharp. A flicker of annoyance crossed Sophie's face. She held her head high. "I understand, but I don't appreciate being stopped without cause. If necessary, I'll come with you to the station." Marcus's lips curled into a mocking smile. "I don't need your permission," he growled, yanking the bag from her shoulder. "Excuse me, what are you doing?" Sophie's voice rose as she tried to snatch the bag back. Marcus ignored her, rifling through her belongings without hesitation. Ethan shifted uneasily, glancing at the bystanders who had begun to gather. "Don't move," Marcus barked, cutting off any protest from his partner. The murmurs of onlookers grew louder. Some paused out of curiosity, while others whispered and hurried on. Sophie's pulse quickened, heat rising in her chest. She turned to Ethan, desperation in her eyes. "You know this isn't right. Why won't you say something?" Ethan's gaze dropped to the pavement. "I'm just following protocol," he mumbled. Marcus slammed the bag back into Sophie's arms. "Clean," he muttered. "But I'm not done yet." Sophie took a step back, gripping her bag tightly. "What do you mean?" Marcus crouched, and to Sophie's horror, his rough hands began lifting the hem of her dress. "No, stop it!" Sophie shouted, stepping away and pulling the dress down. Marcus's grip was relentless, tugging the fabric up past her knees. A hush fell over the crowd, only broken by the whispers of a nearby woman named Martha. "This is disgraceful," Martha whispered to her husband. "She looks rich. Maybe she's hiding something," the man replied, shrugging. Sophie's face burned with humiliation. She slapped Marcus's hand away, fury erupting in her chest. "How dare you? This is harassment. I'll report you." Marcus's cold laugh echoed in the air. "Report me? Go ahead. I'm just doing my job," he sneered. Ethan took a hesitant step forward, his voice barely audible. "Marcus, maybe that's enough." Marcus's head snapped toward him. "Don't tell me how to do my job," he growled, eyes narrowing. "Do you want to keep yours?" Ethan froze, his face pale. Reluctantly, he retreated. Sophie's hands trembled, but she held her ground. "You're abusing your authority," she said, her voice trembling but firm. Marcus leaned closer, his smirk unwavering. "What are you going to do about it?" A man named David, dressed in a sharp navy suit, watched from a distance. "Cops like that do whatever they want," he muttered to his friend. "No consequences." David's words echoed in Sophie's mind, deepening the sense of isolation pressing down on her. Enough. Ethan's voice finally broke through the tense air. He stepped between Marcus and Sophie, gripping his partner's arm. "You've crossed the line." Marcus's eyes flashed with warning. "Watch yourself, Ethan. One wrong move and you're out." Ethan hesitated, but eventually stepped aside, defeated. Time slowed for Sophie. The weight of the crowd's stares, the humiliation of Marcus's touch, it all pressed against her, suffocating. "This isn't over," Sophie whispered, meeting Marcus's gaze. "You'll regret this." Marcus shrugged, amusement flickering in his eyes. "I'll be waiting." Sophie turned sharply, weaving through the onlookers with her head held high, though shame gnawed at her. The whispers followed her down the street, each step heavier than the last. Her grip on the handbag tightened as if it anchored her to reality. Sophie's face burned, not just with embarrassment, but with a fire that refused to die. Marcus had crossed a line, and she wouldn't let him walk away. Marcus settled into the driver's seat of the patrol car, his chuckle lingering in the air. "She'll remember me for the rest of her life," he muttered with a smirk. Ethan sat silently beside him, gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The weight of guilt pressed down hard. After a long pause, he finally spoke. Marcus, don't you think that was too much? His voice wavered slightly. Marcus didn't even glance at him. Too much? He scoffed. I'm just doing my job. You think criminals sit around politely waiting for justice? You've got a lot to learn, Ethan. If you want to survive, you'd better figure out how to use your authority. Ethan clenched his jaw but said nothing. His stomach twisted at the way Marcus justified his actions. Yet, the shadow of Marcus's connections with senior officers loomed large. Ethan knew that standing up to him could mean the end of his career. Across town, Sophie stood in front of her small bathroom mirror. Her reflection revealed tear-stained cheeks and weary eyes. Her hair, usually styled to perfection, was disheveled from the struggle earlier that evening. Marcus's voice echoed in her mind, every sneer, every insult replaying like a broken record. Her hands trembled as she picked up her phone and dialed her best friend, Clara. The line barely rang twice before Clara answered. Sophie, what's wrong? Sophie's voice cracked. He humiliated me, Clara. Right in front of everyone. And no one helped. They just stared. Clara's voice hardened, anger rising in her tone. What? That's outrageous. Sophie, you can't let him get away with this. You have to report him. Sophie exhaled shakily, pressing her palm to the bathroom counter for support. I know, but who's going to believe me? He's a cop and I'm just nobody. You're not nobody, Clara snapped. Listen to me, you are not alone. I'll help you every step of the way. Sophie wiped her eyes, nodding despite knowing Clara couldn't see her. Thank you, she whispered. Later that evening, Marcus continued patrolling through Maplewood Square. The streets had grown quieter, but his predatory gaze locked onto a young woman waiting at a bus stop. Evening, miss, Marcus greeted, stepping forward. His cold stare made the woman visibly tense. We've received reports of a theft nearby. Mind if I check your bag? The woman, Anna, hesitated, her grip tightening on her shoulder bag. I haven't seen anything, she stammered. Marcus took another step closer. I said, let me see your bag. Before Anna could react, Marcus's hand shot forward, grabbing her shoulder. In one swift motion, he tugged at her shirt, exposing part of her chest. Anna gasped and recoiled, desperately trying to cover herself. Tears welled in her eyes as Marcus rummaged through her bag, sending personal belongings scattering across the sidewalk. Ethan stood nearby, every muscle in his body tense. His fists clenched at his sides as he watched Marcus humiliate yet another innocent woman. He opened his mouth, but before any words could escape, Marcus glanced back at him. Got something to say, Ethan? Marcus's voice was sharp, laced with unspoken threat. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat and lowered his gaze. Nothing. His heart pounded painfully against his ribs as he fought back the urge to intervene. But the familiar fear of losing his job, fear of Marcus's retaliation, held him back once more. That night, Sophie sat at her desk, notebook in hand. She scribbled down every detail she could remember. Marcus's exact words, the bystanders who had watched, the humiliation burning in her chest. Tears splattered onto the page, but Sophie wiped them away and kept writing. The more she wrote, the more her sorrow morphed into something else. Determination. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was Clara. A message popped up. Check this out. It's a women's rights group. They deal with police misconduct. Contact them. They can help you. Sophie stared at the message, hope flickering in her heart. The next morning, Sophie woke from a restless sleep. The weight of Marcus's actions still lingered, but she had made up her mind. She wouldn't stay silent. She dressed simply, pulling on jeans and a plain sweater, but there was fire in her eyes. Before heading to the police station to file her complaint, she stopped by Cafe Verona. Clara was already waiting, her brows knit with concern. Sophie, are you okay? Clara asked the moment she saw her. Sophie set her bag on the table and sat down. I'm okay. I finished writing the report. I'm submitting it today. Clara's eyes softened with admiration. You're brave, Sophie, more than you know. I dug around a little, Clara added. Marcus, this isn't the first time. People say he's been doing this for years, but no one speaks up. Sophie sighed, the thought fueling her anger. That's why he thinks he can do anything he wants, but not this time. I won't let it slide. Clara reached across the table, squeezing Sophie's hand. I'll support you however I can. If you need me to testify, I will. For the first time since the incident, Sophie smiled faintly. But as she left Cafe Verona and stepped into the police station, The reality of what she was about to do hit her like a wave. The station was bustling. Officers came and went, their conversations overlapping. Sophie approached the front desk, where a receptionist with cropped hair barely looked up from her computer. "What do you need?" she asked flatly. Sophie straightened her back. "I want to file a complaint," she said firmly. "It's about Officer Marcus Lane." The receptionist paused, her expression unreadable. "Wait here," she said before disappearing behind a door. As Sophie stood alone in the station lobby, she could feel the eyes of passing officers lingering on her. But she stood tall, ready to face whatever came next. Sophie's heart pounded as she stood at the front desk of the Westfield police station. The receptionist, a woman with cropped blonde hair and sharp eyes, glanced up from her paperwork. "I'd like to file a complaint," Sophie said, her voice steady. "It's about an officer, Marcus Lane." The receptionist's pen hovered midair, her expression unreadable. After a pause, she said briskly, "Wait here," before disappearing behind a door. As Sophie waited, she scanned the room. Officers drifted by, some barely acknowledging her presence, while others cast curious glances her way. She forced herself to stay calm, tightening her grip on the handbag Marcus had rifled through the night before. Then the door opened, and there he was. Marcus's smug grin was unmistakable as he strode toward her. Sophie's stomach twisted. "You really came down here to complain about me?" Marcus chuckled, stopping just a foot away. "That's bold of you." Sophie straightened, though her hands trembled. "I have every right to do this," she said firmly. "You can't intimidate me." Marcus leaned closer, his eyes glinting with arrogance. "You think anyone here's going to take your side? This is my station. I'm part of this system, Sophie." Her pulse quickened, but she didn't break eye contact. "If the system won't stop you, I'll take it further." "I won't stop." Marcus laughed. The sound was cold and empty. "Good luck with that." With a dismissive shrug, he turned and walked back through the door, leaving Sophie standing alone, fuming but determined. Meanwhile, Ethan sat at his desk, barely registering the reports in front of him. His mind kept circling back to Sophie's tearful face the day before and Marcus's unapologetic smirk. "Ethan," a voice interrupted. It was Rob, one of the older officers in the department. He leaned against the desk, eyes narrowed. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Ethan forced a thin smile. "I'm fine. Just work stuff." Rob studied him for a moment before sighing. "I know working with Marcus isn't easy, but Ethan, sometimes silence is the same as agreeing with him." Ethan nodded, though the conflict in his chest didn't ease. Rob's words made sense, but standing up to Marcus wasn't as simple as it sounded. Marcus had sway, connections, and Ethan knew crossing him could end his career. That evening, Sophie returned home exhausted. She slumped onto the couch, recounting the events to her husband Daniel, her voice shaking with frustration. "He laughed at me. Right there in the station," Sophie said, gripping a pillow tightly. "He thinks he's untouchable." Daniel's jaw tensed as he listened. "He won't get away with it. We'll figure this out, Sophie. I promise." Sophie met his gaze, drawing strength from the resolve in his eyes. "I can't let him do this to anyone else." Daniel took her hand. "You won't have to fight this alone." The next morning, Sophie woke early. The fear from the previous day lingered, but so did a fire that wouldn't die down. After Daniel left for work, she spent hours on the phone, contacting advocacy groups, searching online forums, and writing emails. Each call, each message felt like a small step forward. Meanwhile, Marcus continued patrolling as if nothing had happened. Ethan trailed behind him, growing more uneasy with every stop they made. As they passed through Riverside Park, Marcus's eyes locked onto a woman sitting alone on a bench. It was Maria, a local mother who had just dropped her kids off at school. She rested briefly, enjoying the crisp morning air before heading to the market. Marcus approached with the same air of authority he always carried. Ethan followed, silent and tense. "Morning, ma'am," Marcus said, his eyes narrowing. "We've had reports of suspicious activity around here. I'll need to see some ID." Maria glanced up, startled. I don't have it with me," she said hesitantly. "I'm just taking a quick break." Marcus's smirk deepened. "No ID, huh? That's against the law. How do I know you're not up to something?" "I haven't done anything wrong," Maria replied nervously, clutching her purse. Marcus didn't wait for an explanation. He grabbed her bag and tugged at her shirt, roughly pulling it aside as he searched. Maria gasped, scrambling to gather the belongings that spilled onto the ground. A small family photo fluttered onto the grass. Ethan's chest tightened as he watched, frozen in place. Marcus shoved Maria aside, his eyes cold and indifferent. Ethan opened his mouth, ready to stop him, but Marcus's glare flashed his way. "Problem, Ethan?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but laced with warning. Ethan swallowed hard and shook his head. No problem." Marcus dumped Maria's bag onto the bench and stepped back. "Nothing here. Next time, carry ID." Tears welled in Maria's eyes as she hurriedly collected her belongings, her hands trembling. As Marcus turned and walked away, Ethan lagged behind, shame washing over him. He had let it happen again. Maria clutched her bag to her chest, her eyes glistening with tears. "You can't treat me like this," she whispered, her voice trembling. Marcus didn't respond. He simply shrugged and turned his back to her, walking away as if nothing had happened. A few bystanders had stopped to watch, murmurs rippling through the crowd. "It's him again," a man named Carlos whispered to his friend. "That cop's notorious for this. Everyone knows." "Yeah, but what can you do?" his friend replied, shaking his head. "You stand up to the police, and you're asking for trouble." Ethan trailed behind Marcus, his heart thudding heavily in his chest. Marcus's treatment of Sophie had already left a mark, but now Maria too? Ethan felt his resolve cracking. This wasn't what being a police officer was supposed to mean, but speaking out felt like stepping into quicksand. One wrong move, and his entire career could vanish. That afternoon, Sophie's phone buzzed. It was Clara. "Sophie, I've got some news." Clara's excitement was palpable. "I talked to someone at the Women's Legal Alliance. They handle cases like yours. They said they'll help you if you need legal support." Sophie felt a glimmer of hope pierce the weight pressing down on her. "Thank you, Clara. I really need this. I'm sending their contact info to your email. Don't wait. Call them today." "You're not alone, Sophie." Sophie didn't hesitate. As soon as she hung up, she dialed the number Clara had sent. After a few rings, a calm, steady voice answered. "This is Rebecca from the Women's Legal Alliance. How can I help you?" Sophie took a deep breath, recounting the incident with Marcus in quiet detail. Rebecca listened attentively. "Sophie, I'm so sorry you experienced this. Unfortunately, we've dealt with similar cases before. Please send us everything you have, notes, documents, and any witnesses. We'll do everything we can to protect you." For the first time since the incident, Sophie felt a weight begin to lift. That evening, Daniel returned home to find Sophie at the dining table, papers scattered in front of her. "They're going to help me," Sophie said, exhaling slowly. "But I know Marcus isn't going to let this go easily." Daniel rested a hand on her shoulder. "He won't get away with it. We're taking the right steps. You're not doing this alone." Sophie met his gaze, the warmth of his support steadying her nerves. "I know. I'm doing this for Maria too, and anyone else he's hurt." Daniel nodded firmly. "We'll fight this together." That night, Daniel sat in his study, the soft glow of the laptop screen lighting his face. Determined to help Sophie's case, he began searching forums and social media, typing keywords like police misconduct in Westfield and abuse of power by officers. It didn't take long before stories began surfacing, stories eerily similar to Sophie's. None mentioned Marcus by name, but the descriptions of a tall, cold-eyed officer with a smug demeanor fit him perfectly. Sophie entered the room, carrying a mug of tea. "Find anything?" she asked, hope flickering in her eyes. Daniel's brow furrowed as he scrolled. "I think I have. A few posts stand out. I'll reach out to the authors, see if they're willing to talk." Sophie placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Daniel smiled. "You won't have to find out." The next day, Daniel's persistence paid off. While browsing a women's advocacy forum, he stumbled upon an older post from a woman named Natalie. In her post, Natalie recounted a disturbing encounter with an officer who humiliated her during a stop. She hadn't filed a complaint, fearing retaliation, but the description of the officer was unmistakable. Daniel immediately sent her a message. "Hi Natalie, my name is Daniel. I'm reaching out because my wife Sophie experienced something very similar to what you described. We're working on holding this officer accountable. Would you be open to talking?" Hours passed before Natalie replied. "How do I know this isn't a trap?" she asked cautiously. Daniel quickly explained Sophie's experience and their efforts to gather information to build a case. Natalie hesitated but eventually replied, "I'll meet you, but I don't know how much I can help." The next afternoon, they arranged to meet at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. Natalie was in her mid-20s, her nervous energy evident as she clutched her coffee cup tightly. She watched the entrance carefully as Daniel approached. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me," Daniel said gently, sitting across from her. Natalie's eyes darted around. "I don't want him to find out I'm talking to you. He knows how to intimidate people." Daniel leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I understand. We're being careful. You're not alone in this." After a long pause, Natalie finally exhaled. "He stopped me late one evening after work, said I matched the description of a suspect. He searched my bag, and me." Her voice wavered. Daniel's grip tightened around his notepad. "It was Marcus, wasn't it?" Natalie nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "He threatened to arrest me when I resisted. I felt powerless." Daniel's heart ached at her words, but he remained composed. "Natalie, your story is important. We're building a case, and your testimony could help stop him from doing this to anyone else." Natalie hesitated but eventually nodded. "If it helps someone else, I'll do it." Daniel offered a reassuring smile. "Thank you. I know this isn't easy, but you're making a difference." That evening, Daniel recounted the meeting to Sophie. "She's terrified, but she's willing to testify," Daniel said. Sophie's eyes filled with emotion. "She's brave, and she shouldn't have to go through this alone." "We'll keep digging," Daniel said. "Marcus has hurt too many people. It's time he faces justice." Sophie nodded. "One step at a time." Natalie sat in the corner of Elmwood Cafe, her pale hands wrapped tightly around a steaming cup. Her eyes darted toward the door every time it opened, anxiety flickering across her face. When Daniel stepped inside, she watched him carefully, her fingers nervously tapping against the cup's rim. "Thank you for meeting me," Daniel began, offering a warm, reassuring smile. He took a seat across from her, setting his briefcase gently on the table. "I'm not sure how much I can help," Natalie said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've tried to forget, but I can't." Daniel leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Natalie, any information you have is important. This isn't just for Sophie, it's for others like you, people who've been hurt by Marcus." Natalie hesitated, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. After a long pause, she exhaled slowly. "It was a few months ago," she began. "I was walking home from class one evening when a police officer stopped me. He said I looked like someone they were investigating for a robbery." Daniel nodded, carefully jotting down notes. "Do you remember anything about him, his appearance or the way he spoke?" She swallowed hard. Tall, broad-shouldered, short hair, his eyes were cold, arrogant, like he enjoyed the power he held over people. His badge said Marcus Lane. Daniel's hand stiffened slightly around his pen, but he kept his tone calm. "What happened next?" he asked gently. Natalie's grip tightened on her cup, her knuckles turning white. "He said he needed to search my bag. I told him I didn't have anything to hide, but he didn't stop there." Her voice trembled. "He said he had to search me personally. He led me toward an alley, away from the main street." Daniel remained silent, giving her space to continue. Natalie's hands shook as she whispered, "He touched me, treated me like I wasn't even a person. I told him to stop, but he threatened to arrest me for resisting. I was terrified." Daniel clenched his jaw, his fists curling under the table. "Did you tell anyone? Report him?" Natalie shook her head, staring down at the table. "Who would believe me? He's a cop. I was just a student. I was scared that if I said anything, he'd come after me, or my family." Daniel took a deep breath, forcing the anger in his chest to settle. "Natalie, you don't have to be afraid anymore. We're building a case against him. If you're willing to testify, we'll do everything we can to protect you." Tears welled in Natalie's eyes, but she met Daniel's gaze with a newfound resolve. "I don't want to see him again," she whispered, "but if it helps others, I'll do it." Daniel smiled gently, his gratitude sincere. "Thank you, Natalie. This isn't easy, but it could make all the difference. We'll stand by you every step of the way." That evening, Daniel recounted Natalie's story to Sophie as they sat at the kitchen table. "She's so young," Sophie murmured, tears forming in her eyes. "It's horrible that she had to go through that alone." Daniel nodded. "She's brave for coming forward, and I think there are more people like her out there." Sophie squeezed his hand. "I'm grateful for you, Daniel. I don't think I could do this without you. Daniel smiled softly, but his eyes burned with determination. Justice isn't just for you, Sophie. It's for everyone Marcus has hurt. The next day, Daniel reached out to another potential witness, Clara, a cashier at a busy market downtown. When they met at a cafe near her workplace, Clara's hands trembled as she stirred her tea. She wore a long coat and sunglasses, as if trying to stay invisible. "Thank you for coming," Daniel began, sensing her unease. "I'm Daniel, Sophie's husband. She's been through something similar." Clara shivered slightly at the mention of Marcus. "He's a monster," she whispered, glancing around nervously. "He stopped me right outside my store, in front of everyone." Daniel leaned in, listening intently. "He said I looked suspicious, demanded my ID. I told him I'd left it inside. That's when he grabbed my bag, dumped everything out, and—" Clara's voice cracked. "He tore open my blouse. I was humiliated. I just stood there, frozen." Daniel's heart twisted. "Clara, I know this is difficult, but if you're willing to testify, we can stop him." Clara stared down at her tea for a long moment. "I don't want to face him," she admitted. "But if this can help others, I'll do it." Daniel nodded, grateful for her courage. Meanwhile, Ethan sat in the patrol car beside Marcus. Marcus chuckled to himself, leaning back casually as if the world was his playground. Ethan stared straight ahead, the images of Maria's tears, Sophie's humiliation, and the silent cries of other victims looping in his mind. "What's got you so quiet?" Marcus asked, catching Ethan's reflection in the rearview mirror. "Nothing," Ethan muttered, suppressing the fire rising in his chest. Marcus smirked. "You need to loosen up. This job isn't for the soft-hearted, Ethan." Ethan forced a nod, but deep down he knew something had to change. Marcus had crossed too many lines, and Ethan couldn't keep looking the other way. Ethan stammered, his gaze fixed on the dashboard. "You need to loosen up," Marcus said, smirking. "This job isn't for the weak." Ethan lowered his head, swallowing his frustration. But deep down, he knew he couldn't stay silent forever. Maybe Sophie and Daniel were the chance he needed to finally take a stand. That evening, Daniel returned home, dropping a folder filled with notes onto the kitchen table. His face was drawn with exhaustion, but there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. "I found 3 people willing to testify," he told Sophie. Sophie's eyes widened. "Really? They've all had experiences with Marcus?" Daniel nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "Each of them has a story, and they all lead back to him. I think we have enough to start building a solid case." Relief washed over Sophie. The road ahead felt daunting, but knowing others were willing to speak out made her feel less alone. "Thank you, Daniel," she whispered. "We're doing this not just for me, but for everyone he's hurt." Daniel took her hand, his gaze unwavering. Marcus won't get away with this forever. The next day, Sophie entered the office of the Women's Legal Alliance, her heart pounding with nervous anticipation. The organization had arranged a formal meeting to gather details about her case and assess the evidence. A woman with short black hair and a navy blue blazer greeted Sophie with a warm smile. "You must be Sophie. I'm Rebecca, the one you spoke with over the phone. Please, have a seat." Sophie settled into the chair, gripping her handbag tightly. "Thank you for meeting with me. I'm nervous, but I know I have to do this." Rebecca nodded, her expression serious but kind. "You're making the right decision. But first, I'll need you to recount everything that happened. Start from the beginning, and don't leave out any details." Sophie took a breath and began telling her story, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger as she spoke. "Marcus has done this before," she said. "I'm not the only one." Rebecca listened intently, jotting down notes. "We've actually received multiple reports about Marcus Lane," Rebecca said once Sophie finished. "If we don't act now, he'll continue abusing his authority." Beside Rebecca sat Peter, a young but seasoned attorney. He adjusted his glasses and thumbed through the stack of documents Sophie had brought. "We'll need testimony from other victims to strengthen your case," Peter said. Sophie nodded and handed him Daniel's list. "My husband reached out to several people, Marina, Clara, and Natalie. They've all agreed to testify, though they're afraid Marcus might retaliate." Peter gave her an encouraging smile. "That's a strong start. Don't worry. We'll take measures to protect everyone involved." Rebecca's expression hardened slightly. "Sophie, you need to be prepared. Marcus isn't going to back down without a fight, and sometimes the system doesn't work as it should." Are you ready for that? Sophie clenched her hands together, her eyes gleaming with resolve. I'm ready. I'm doing this for all of us. The meeting lasted over 2 hours. By the end, a clear strategy had been outlined. Rebecca assured Sophie that an official lawsuit would be filed soon, and Peter began organizing witness statements. As Sophie stepped out of the office, the weight on her shoulders felt lighter. Daniel was waiting at the front door when she arrived home. How did it go? He asked. Sophie smiled faintly. They're incredible. We have a plan. Daniel wrapped an arm around her. I'll be with you every step of the way. Marcus will pay for what he's done. The next morning, Peter visited Marina at her small apartment. She had already prepared a folder of documents, but her hands shook as she passed them to him. Thank you for coming, Peter said, his tone gentle. Marina's eyes flickered with hesitation. Do you really think we can win, Marcus? He's not someone who backs down easily. Peter smiled reassuringly. We don't need him to back down. We just need the truth. And you have that. Your voice matters, Marina. Later that afternoon, Rebecca met Clara at her usual cafe. Clara nervously fiddled with the edge of a piece of paper covered in her notes. I don't want him to keep hurting others, Clara said, her voice stronger than it had been before. If I have to face him, I will. Rebecca nodded, placing her hand over Clara's. You won't have to do it alone. At the police station, Marcus had begun to feel the shift in atmosphere. His colleagues' glances lingered longer, and the once casual conversations around him seemed laced with tension. Ethan noticed it too. The weight of Marcus's actions hung heavily over him, and he knew the moment for silence was ending. One day, while sitting in the break room, Ethan spotted Rob, the older officer who often offered advice. Rob, Ethan said quietly. Can I ask you something? Rob raised an eyebrow, setting down his coffee. Of course. What's on your mind? Ethan hesitated before speaking. It's about Marcus. Rob's gaze darkened slightly, but he didn't seem surprised. You're worried, Rob said knowingly. Ethan nodded. I don't know what to do. I've let this go on for too long. Rob placed a firm hand on Ethan's shoulder. Listen, Ethan, doing the right thing isn't always easy, but silence only feeds the problem. If you see something wrong, speak up. You might be the reason it stops. Ethan's stomach tightened, but Rob's words echoed in his mind long after he left the break room, and for the first time, Ethan considered breaking that silence. Ethan nodded, his eyes heavy with the weight of his thoughts. I can't keep ignoring it, but if I speak up, my career could be over. Rob patted him firmly on the shoulder. Doing the right thing isn't easy, Ethan, but staying silent, that makes you part of the problem. If you want things to change, it has to start with you. Rob's words echoed in Ethan's mind long after he left the break room. That night, unable to shake the growing sense of guilt, Ethan picked up his phone. His hands trembled slightly as he dialed. Rebecca? It's Ethan. I need to meet with you. I have information about Marcus. Rebecca's voice on the other end was calm and steady. Thank you, Ethan. This could change everything. Later that evening, Sophie's phone rang. She answered quickly, recognizing Rebecca's number. Sophie, I have some important news, Rebecca said, her voice laced with excitement. Someone from inside the police department wants to help us. Sophie froze, gripping the phone tighter. Who is it? He wants to remain anonymous for now, but his testimony could be the breakthrough we need. Sophie's heart pounded. Thank you, Rebecca. This gives me hope. Daniel, watching from across the room, noticed Sophie's expression shift. What is it? He asked. Sophie lowered the phone slowly. Someone from inside is willing to help. Marcus won't get away with this. Daniel's eyes narrowed with determination. This time, justice is coming for him. The next morning, Sophie woke with renewed resolve. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but having an ally within the force gave her strength. At breakfast, Daniel sifted through papers at the kitchen table. Helen called, he said, setting his coffee aside. She's reached out to a journalist at the Westfield Times. They're interested in covering your story. Sophie's hand hovered over her mug. Will it be safe? Marcus won't stay quiet if this goes public. We'll be careful, Daniel reassured her. They'll protect your identity and the witnesses' names until the case goes to court. At the office, Rebecca and Peter prepared for a crucial meeting. Marina, Clara, and Natalie were scheduled to provide statements to strengthen the case. Marina arrived first, looking anxious but more composed than before. She slid a stack of written testimony onto the table. "I won't let him keep hurting people," she said, her voice steady. Clara followed shortly after, offering Marina a soft, encouraging smile. "We're stronger together," she said. "If we stick to the truth, we can stop him." Natalie, the last to arrive, adjusted her scarf nervously, but kept her head high. "I told my family," she said quietly. "They support me testifying." Peter smiled at the group. "Thank you for your courage. With all of your voices, Marcus won't be able to hide anymore." Rebecca began outlining the next steps. "The official lawsuit will be filed next week. In the meantime, prepare yourselves. The defense will question you, and they'll try to shake your confidence. Stay firm. Don't let them intimidate you." Marina frowned. "Can they bring up things that have nothing to do with Marcus?" Rebecca nodded. "Yes, but remember, they're trying to rattle you. Stay focused on the truth." At the station, Marcus had begun to notice the shift in atmosphere. The sideways glances from fellow officers, the hushed conversations that stopped when he entered the room. Ethan felt it too. Later that day, Ethan spotted Rob in the break room and pulled him aside. "I can't stop thinking about Marcus." "Everything he's done," Ethan admitted. Rob crossed his arms, leaning against the counter. "Then stop thinking about it and do something." Ethan hesitated before exhaling deeply. "You're right." That afternoon, he met Rebecca at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. Dressed in plain clothes, Ethan scanned the area nervously before sliding into a corner seat. "I'm Ethan," he said, his voice low. "I work with Marcus. I've seen what he's done. I stayed silent, but I can't anymore." Rebecca smiled gently. "Thank you for coming, Ethan. This isn't easy, but it's a vital step." Ethan's hands trembled slightly. "Marcus has ties with people higher up. That's why he's always gotten away with it. But if necessary, I'm willing to testify." Rebecca jotted down the details as Ethan spoke, nodding thoughtfully. "Your information is critical," she said. "We'll do everything we can to protect you." As Ethan stood to leave, he met Rebecca's gaze one last time. "Make sure justice is served. I can't watch this happen anymore." The next day, Sophie met Helen at Cafe Verona. Helen slid a folded newspaper across the table, her eyes gleaming. "Have you seen this?" she asked. Sophie glanced down. The headline caught her attention immediately. "Anonymous testimonies reveal patterns of abuse by local officer." Her heart skipped a beat. "It's spreading fast," Helen added, taking a sip of coffee. Sophie stared at the article, a mix of relief and anxiety filling her chest. This could help, but Marcus is going to be furious. Helen met her gaze firmly. "Let him be. The truth is louder than his threats." Daniel smiled reassuringly. "Don't worry," he said. "The women's rights organizations are behind you. We have strong allies." Sophie nodded, her eyes reflecting unwavering determination. "I'm not afraid of him. I just want justice." At the police station, Marcus gripped the newspaper tightly, his knuckles white with fury. The headline glaring back at him felt like a personal attack. "They dare to print this about me? Who leaked this?" he growled, slamming the paper onto his desk. Across the room, Ethan stood silently, watching the outburst. But for the first time, he didn't feel afraid. Instead, he felt relief. Marcus's power was beginning to crack, and Ethan knew he had done the right thing. That afternoon, Sophie's phone rang. It was Peter. "Sophie, I have news," he said. "We've officially filed the lawsuit. The first hearing is scheduled for 2 weeks from now." Sophie let out a long breath, her heart pounding. "Thank you, Peter. Do you think we stand a chance?" "With the evidence we've gathered, I believe justice will prevail," Peter replied confidently. Sophie felt a renewed sense of hope. This time, she wasn't alone. The day of the trial arrived faster than Sophie anticipated. As she stepped into the courtroom, her palms felt clammy, and her nerves threatened to overwhelm her. Daniel walked beside her, holding her hand tightly. "I'm here," he whispered. "We'll get through this." Across the room, Marcus sat with his lawyer, his cold eyes flickering towards Sophie with a smirk. He leaned back in his chair, exuding the same arrogance he had the day he humiliated her. Peter and Rebecca stood at the front of the courtroom, meticulously organized with folders, witness statements, and documents. In the audience, Marina, Clara, and Natalie sat quietly, each of them holding their own resolve. Ethan entered through the side door, keeping his gaze low as he made his way to the front row. He nodded once at Rebecca, but avoided Marcus's glare. The judge entered, and the courtroom fell silent. This case involves allegations of abuse of power and inappropriate conduct by Officer Marcus Lane, the judge declared. We will hear testimonies from both sides before reaching a verdict. Peter rose to deliver the opening statement. Your Honor, we are here to prove that Officer Marcus Lane repeatedly misused his authority to violate the rights and dignity of multiple individuals. We will present testimony and evidence demonstrating a clear pattern of abuse. Marcus's lawyer stood with a smirk. My client has done nothing more than fulfill his duties as an officer of the law. These accusations are baseless, driven by misunderstandings and exaggerations. Sophie's hands tightened in her lap. This trial was not going to be easy. Marina was the first to take the witness stand. She took a shaky breath, gripping the microphone. That evening, I was walking home from class when Marcus stopped me, she began, her voice trembling but steady. He said I matched a suspect and searched my bag. Then he took me to a secluded area and searched me, violating my dignity. Marcus's lawyer rose slowly, his expression cold. Miss Marina, do you have any physical evidence to support this claim, or is this simply your word against Officer Lane's? Marina's cheeks flushed, but she held her ground. I don't have photos or video, but I know what happened. He threatened to arrest me if I resisted. Rebecca stood quickly. Your Honor, Marina is not the only witness. We will present additional testimony to demonstrate that this was not an isolated incident. Next was Clara. She walked to the stand, her eyes fierce with determination, though her hands trembled slightly. He humiliated me outside the store where I work, Clara said clearly. He grabbed my bag, tore my blouse, and left me standing there in front of everyone. Marcus's lawyer approached her slowly. Mrs. Clara, are you perhaps exaggerating? Could it be that Marcus was simply doing his job? Clara's gaze hardened. I have no reason to lie. He humiliated me, and I don't want anyone else to go through what I did. Then Ethan was called to the stand. The courtroom grew tense. Ethan stepped forward, gripping the edges of the witness box tightly. He avoided Marcus's glare and focused on the judge. I've worked alongside Marcus for years, Ethan began, his voice steady. I've witnessed him abusing his power on countless occasions, targeting people he thought couldn't fight back. I stayed silent for too long. I can't anymore. Marcus's eyes narrowed, his stare fixed on Ethan like a blade, but Ethan didn't flinch. Marcus's lawyer rose quickly. Officer Ethan, do you hold any personal resentment toward Marcus? Could this be motivated by professional jealousy? Ethan shook his head. No, I'm speaking because it's the right thing to do. My silence was my biggest mistake, and I'm here to make it right. After the testimonies concluded, Rebecca handed over a stack of documents to the judge, previous complaints against Marcus that had been ignored or dismissed. Peter stood to deliver his final remarks. Your Honor, this is not a single incident. This is a pattern, one that Officer Lane believed he could continue without consequence. The testimonies and documents show the severity of his misconduct. We ask the court to hold him accountable. Marcus's lawyer attempted to shift the blame, suggesting the victims were exaggerating for personal gain. But the weight of evidence was undeniable. As the judge reviewed the case, the courtroom fell into a tense silence. Finally, the judge's voice broke the quiet. After reviewing the evidence and testimonies, the court finds sufficient grounds to proceed with the charges against Officer Marcus Lane. A subsequent trial will determine his sentencing. Sophie exhaled deeply, tears welling in her eyes. Daniel squeezed her hand, offering a soft smile. We're one step closer, he said. As they left the courtroom, Marina, Clara, and Natalie approached Sophie, gratitude in their eyes. We did this together. Marina said, her voice thick with emotion. Ethan approached Sophie before leaving. I'm sorry for not speaking up sooner, he said quietly. Sophie met his gaze with understanding. You spoke up when it mattered. That's what counts. The judge's gaze swept across the courtroom as the final documents and testimonies were reviewed. After considering all evidence and statements, the judge began, his voice echoing in the silent room. The court finds sufficient grounds to prosecute the defendant, Marcus Lane, for abuse of power and violation of personal rights. A subsequent trial will determine the appropriate sentence. Sophie's breath caught in her throat, and tears welled in her eyes. She gripped Daniel's hand as he smiled softly, reassuring her with a gentle squeeze. We've taken the first step, he whispered. As they exited the courtroom, Marina, Clara, and Natalie approached, relief and gratitude evident on their faces. Marina reached for Sophie's hand. "Thank you, Sophie. Without you, I would have stayed silent." Sophie's voice trembled with emotion. "We did this together. This victory belongs to all of us." Ethan approached hesitantly, his gaze lowered. "Sophie, I'm sorry for not speaking up sooner." Sophie met his eyes with kindness. "You're here now. That's what matters." That evening, Sophie sat at her desk, flipping through the notes she had written during the long weeks leading up to the trial. Daniel stepped beside her, placing his hand gently on her shoulder. "Marcus will be held accountable," he said. "You've made a difference." Sophie looked up at him, her eyes shining with resolve. "Not just for me, for everyone he's hurt." The final day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was filled with anticipation. The weight of the moment was palpable as Marcus sat at the defense table, his usual smugness replaced with quiet tension. The judge entered, opening the case file as the courtroom fell silent. After thoroughly reviewing the evidence and testimonies, the judge began, his voice firm and unwavering. "The court concludes that the defendant, Marcus Lane, has committed severe violations of human rights, abused his position of power, and degraded the dignity of others." Marcus's jaw tightened as the judge continued. "The defendant is hereby sentenced to 5 years in prison and is permanently barred from serving in law enforcement." The room erupted in quiet sighs of relief and a few hushed sobs of joy. Sophie's eyes locked onto Marcus as he lowered his head, the arrogance that once defined him finally stripped away. Daniel squeezed her hand tightly. "We've won," he whispered. Rebecca approached with a warm smile. "You did it, Sophie. Justice has been served." Outside the courthouse, Marina, Clara, and Natalie gathered around Sophie, tears streaming down their faces. "We're not afraid anymore," Marina said, her voice trembling with emotion. Sophie smiled through her tears. "This victory belongs to all of us." Sophie's story, and the courage of the others who stood beside her, reminds us that justice isn't automatic. It takes strength, perseverance, and unity. Despite Marcus's abuse of power, the determination of one woman and the support of her community brought him to justice. This is a powerful reminder that silence in the face of injustice makes us complicit. But when people stand together, even the most powerful perpetrators cannot escape accountability. The strength of truth and courage always prevails. If this story moved you, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support inspires us to keep sharing heartwarming and powerful stories every day. Thank you for watching. See you soon.